As I sat transfixed at the dinner table, cruel laughter echoing around me, I suddenly realized that the woman I had dedicated my life to had just exposed my deepest self-doubts for the amusement of her friends. She had succeeded, but after my friends had left, I told her. And here's how it was. I still vividly recall the anticipation mixed with anxiety that filled my chest on that Saturday evening as I prepared everything meticulously for the dinner party my wife had so eagerly insisted we host. She had been pressing for this event for weeks, constantly reminding me that networking with her colleagues and their spouses would provide invaluable opportunities to enhance both our social standing and her career trajectory. Despite my personal reservations, especially given that social interactions were never truly my strong suit, I agreed enthusiastically, knowing how much this mattered to her. Throughout that afternoon, I poured immense effort into every detail, believing that perfection in the smallest things would reflect well upon us as a couple. The house was spotless, each room cleaned thoroughly, surfaces gleaming with a faint scent of citrus cleaner still lingering pleasantly in the air. I had set the table with our best dinnerware, ensuring every detail reflected positively upon us. Candles stood symmetrically down the length of the table, ready to provide the warm, inviting atmosphere my wife had requested so explicitly. Cooking, though something I genuinely enjoyed, became an unusually stressful affair that day, as I meticulously prepared each of the 3 courses we had planned together the previous evening. For the appetizer, I chose something refined yet simple enough to appeal broadly: bruschetta topped with heirloom tomatoes, fresh basil, and just a delicate drizzle of balsamic reduction. The main course featured perfectly seared salmon, served alongside herb-roasted potatoes and crisp asparagus, precisely the combination she assured me would impress her health-conscious coworkers. Lastly, dessert was a delicate crème brûlée, a dish that required precise attention and which had me anxiously glancing at the oven timer repeatedly. When everything was finally in place, I took a deep breath, adjusting my neatly pressed shirt as the first guests arrived at precisely 7:30. My wife opened the door with her practiced warm smile, effortlessly charming everyone as she guided them inside and introduced me with carefully constructed compliments. I exchanged firm handshakes and friendly nods, doing my best to hide any lingering nervousness behind polite conversation and subtle humor. The initial reactions were reassuring. Guests seemed genuinely pleased, remarking warmly on the inviting atmosphere and the tempting aroma wafting from the kitchen. As we settled comfortably into the evening, guests engaged in casual, light-hearted conversation around the appetizer course, their laughter ringing pleasantly through the house. Compliments about the food and presentation were frequent and sincere, which gradually helped me relax my stiff posture and ease my internal worries. I found myself actually enjoying their company, surprised by how smoothly everything was going, given my initial apprehension. Glancing over at my wife, who was already finishing her second glass of wine, I noted how content and radiant she appeared in her element. Charming, confident, entirely at ease. Yet, despite my growing comfort, something faintly unsettling tugged at the back of my mind, a familiar sensation of unease subtly creeping beneath the pleasant facade of the evening. I pushed it aside, attributing the feeling simply to nerves or perhaps an overly cautious imagination. Tonight, I told myself firmly, was about making her proud, showcasing us as the polished couple she always wanted us to portray. Little did I know at that moment that my instinctive unease was justified, serving as a silent warning of what was to come. Just as I was beginning to feel truly relaxed and comfortable in my role as host, I noticed that my wife had already begun her 3rd glass of wine. Usually, her drinking didn't concern me, but tonight, her reckless mood set off quiet alarm bells. I watched her closely, noting how animated and increasingly confident her gestures were becoming, her laughter growing louder, almost theatrical, drawing more attention with each passing minute. Still, I quietly hoped that my concern was merely an overreaction, perhaps due to my anxiety that everything was going perfectly according to our original plans. Unfortunately, my hopes were quickly dashed when I heard the conversation at the table suddenly and awkwardly turn to the topic of relationships. My wife's eyes twinkled mischievously as she leaned forward, turning her attention directly to me with a knowing smile that always signaled impending embarrassment or discomfort. My heart began to beat faster as I mentally prepared myself for what she might say next, feeling vulnerable, exposed, but trying to appear relaxed, maintaining an outward composure. She laughed softly at something one of her coworkers said, then raised her voice enough to silence everyone at the table, clearly ensuring that she had their undivided attention. "You know what's funny?" she began, looking around at her coworkers with exaggerated amusement clearly reflected in her eyes. "When I first met him, I honestly thought I'd found the perfect guy. Tall, successful, impressive, and strong in absolutely every area." She paused dramatically, deliberately emphasizing the word all, causing several knowing smiles to spread across the table, curious and intrigued. I felt my stomach clench uncomfortably as the male guest directly across from us leaned forward, eyes twinkling mischievously, asking, "And you're saying he's not like that?" Laughter rippled through the group, at first assuming it was just innocent teasing between loving spouses, meant only as a joke. But instead of gently reassuring me or diverting the conversation, my wife leaned into the joke, dramatically pressing her thumb and forefinger together, leaving just the slightest bit of space between them. "Let's just say," she announced loudly, clearly aiming her remark directly at me, "some things just don't live up to initial expectations." Instantly the room erupted in awkward laughter, several guests shifting uneasily, sensing that boundaries were being crossed in a public and awkward manner. My cheeks burned furiously as I stared at my untouched plate, desperately hoping the conversation would return to less personal territory. My wife, however, was not finished, seemingly buoyed by the laughter she had elicited and the attention her comments had attracted. "Honestly," she continued, her eyes glittering with a mixture of amusement and derision, "sometimes it feels like being married to an awkward teenager. Quick to start, quicker to finish, if you know what I mean." Another burst of laughter echoed painfully around me, louder this time, more genuine, but with a noticeable tinge of awkward sympathy from those seated closest. A female colleague, clearly uncomfortable, attempted to gently redirect the discussion by suggesting a new topic to ease the obvious tension. My wife quickly brushed off her colleague's kindness with a dismissive smile before turning directly to the group, eager to deliver another humiliating joke at my expense. "Oh, relax," she insisted dramatically, mockingly raising her wine glass in my direction. "We all have our crosses to bear in life. Mine just happens to be considerably smaller than most." She laughed freely, clearly pleased with herself, while the others reluctantly joined in, their smiles more forced than genuine. In that excruciatingly humiliating moment, I felt something important slowly begin to break within me, my dignity publicly undermined, my confidence severely shaken, my pride cruelly stripped at my own dinner table. What hurt me most was not just the mocking words themselves, though they were deep enough, but the realization of her blatant disregard for how deeply those words affected me. Watching her nonchalant expression as she casually continued to joke with others, I finally realized the heartbreaking truth I had long ignored. The woman I married saw me primarily as entertainment for others, and tonight the joke was devastatingly at my expense. That evening, after our guests had finally departed, leaving behind empty wine bottles and scattered crumbs, I found myself sitting alone in the dimly lit kitchen, replaying the events in my mind. My wife had already retreated to our bedroom, seemingly oblivious, or perhaps deliberately indifferent, to the humiliation and pain she had inflicted upon me at the dinner table only hours earlier. Her laughter still echoed painfully in my head, a mocking chorus joined by the awkward chuckles of our guests, each sound reverberating through my wounded pride with unbearable intensity. Though the humiliation from tonight was fresh and raw, I began recognizing with alarming clarity that it was merely one instance among countless others I'd previously chosen to overlook. Slowly, as memories surfaced unbidden in the quiet solitude of the empty room, I realized that this pattern of subtle yet persistent cruelty had existed long before this disastrous evening. In the early years of our marriage, I had dismissed her small comments and sharp criticisms, convincing myself they were harmless jokes or minor observations offered in good faith, rather than calculated attacks on my confidence. Whenever we prepared to attend events together, she gently advised that I wear shoes with thicker soles, suggesting it might help me appear taller and more authoritative among her professional friends. At the time, I'd accepted this advice, believing she genuinely had my best interests in mind, even thanking her for her thoughtful attention to detail. But those seemingly innocent suggestions soon grew more pointed, evolving into criticisms that no longer masked her disdain beneath thin layers of humor or politeness. When I earned a significant promotion 3 years prior, an achievement I'd worked tirelessly to attain, I excitedly shared the news, hoping she'd feel proud and celebrate alongside me. Instead, her response cut swiftly and deeply into my enthusiasm, remarking dismissively that my employers must not have had many other qualified candidates from which to choose that particular year. I remember standing in stunned silence, champagne unopened in my hand, while she launched immediately into detailed discussions of her own professional triumphs, leaving my accomplishments utterly overshadowed. Family gatherings provided yet another arena for her subtle belittling, carefully presented under the guise of affectionate teasing that concealed the cruelty hidden just below the surface. At these events, she'd introduce me to distant relatives with casual but cutting comments, declaring lightly, "This is my husband. He's not exactly what I imagined when I dreamed about marriage as a young girl, but we make do anyway." Though accompanied by her charming smile and pleasant demeanor, these words carried unmistakable implications, suggesting clearly, though subtly, that I consistently fell short of her expectations and remained undeserving of her affection. Each incident individually felt trivial at the time, easy enough to shrug off or ignore, but collectively, they created deep wounds I hadn't fully recognized until tonight. Even my personal hobbies, chosen purely out of passion or curiosity, became targets of her criticism, gradually sapping away my enthusiasm until nothing remained but quiet resignation. When I excitedly enrolled in guitar lessons, fulfilling a lifelong desire I'd long set aside for more practical considerations, she openly mocked my attempts in phone conversations with her friends. She laughingly shared anecdotes about my supposed struggles, remarking loudly enough for me to overhear that my fingers were simply too small to handle certain chords properly, reducing my genuine passion into a mere punchline. Within just a few months, I abandoned guitar entirely, too ashamed to continue pursuing something she'd made me feel hopelessly inadequate about. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of her behavior became apparent whenever we attended social events together, as she'd consistently praise and encourage me privately beforehand, building my confidence temporarily, only to tear it down publicly moments later. Tonight's humiliation at dinner, brutal and public though it was, suddenly became clear not as an isolated incident, but rather as part of a larger, insidious pattern I'd subconsciously learned to accept. The stark realization dawned painfully within me that the woman who had promised love, support, and partnership had instead spent our marriage methodically chipping away at my self-esteem, reshaping me into someone who barely recognized his own worth. Sitting alone, the clock ticking quietly on the kitchen wall, clarity finally broke through the fog of self-doubt I'd unknowingly carried for years, awakening me to a devastating yet necessary truth. What I dismissed as harmless teasing or minor imperfections in our relationship was, in reality, emotional abuse carefully hidden beneath layers of charm, humor, and false affection. Understanding this harsh truth left me shaken yet strangely resolute, determined now to face whatever painful decisions lay ahead to reclaim the dignity I'd allowed her to slowly dismantle. In the days following that disastrous dinner, I began noticing subtle changes in my wife's behavior, nuances I'd previously dismissed or overlooked, attributing them simply to stress or distraction from her demanding career. Suddenly, details that had seemed insignificant took on a troubling significance, making me hyper-aware of patterns I'd allowed myself to ignore in our 8 years together. Each time she entered a room, her phone would instinctively go face down on the nearest surface, its screen hidden carefully as though guarding secrets far beyond ordinary workplace conversations. The careful secrecy extended to late-night calls she'd abruptly answer outside on our patio, claiming they involved urgent matters at work, even when the timing made little sense professionally or logically. These behaviors had once seemed innocent enough, rationalized easily as privacy needs related strictly to her job sensitivity, but now they felt suspiciously intentional and deeply unsettling. An uncomfortable instinct had quietly begun forming within me, urging that perhaps my trust had been misplaced, leaving me vulnerable to truths I had deliberately ignored. Yet, even as doubts settled heavier within my chest, I found myself struggling internally, desperately hoping these suspicions were unfounded paranoia born from recent humiliations rather than actual deceit. That fragile hope shattered completely one evening when fate, or perhaps bitter irony, finally provided undeniable confirmation of the painful reality I feared most. 2 nights after the humiliating dinner, my wife stepped into the shower, carelessly leaving her phone lying exposed and unattended upon the kitchen countertop. Normally, I would never even consider invading her privacy by glancing through messages or checking call histories, firmly believing in mutual respect and trust that formed the foundation of our relationship. Tonight, however, driven by an unfamiliar compulsion, a desperate need for clarity amid growing suspicion, I found myself drawn inexorably toward the softly vibrating device, its screen lighting up continuously with incoming notifications. The anxiety tightening my chest only intensified as my eyes fell upon the glowing screen, revealing explicit messages clearly sent from someone she'd saved simply as work project lead. The brief glimpses displayed on the lock screen offered enough context to send my heart plunging painfully, each word slicing deeper into the fragile trust I'd carefully maintained throughout years of marriage. "Missing you already," read one particularly cruel line, followed swiftly by another message, brazen and unapologetically clear. "Last night was incredible. When can you get away again?" Trembling fingers somehow managed to unlock her phone, my heart hammering wildly in my chest as I scrolled through months of messages exchanged intimately between her and this supposed colleague. The reality sank heavily upon me. The person she'd identified casually as a project lead was, in truth, a co-worker of equal rank whose wife had unknowingly sat directly across from me during our humiliating dinner. Message after explicit message detailed secret encounters at upscale hotels, carefully planned rendezvous over lunches or dinners supposedly dedicated strictly to work responsibilities. They laughed openly at my expense, mocking my blind trust and obliviousness, cruelly amused by how effortlessly they'd managed to deceive me. My eyes burned painfully, yet I found myself unable to tear away, reading every humiliating line as though confirming each betrayal would somehow grant understanding or closure. But nothing could diminish the gut-wrenching pain inflicted by reading my wife's own words, proudly boasting to her lover about publicly humiliating me, describing with ruthless clarity how she deliberately used our dinner party as entertainment. "He just sits there and takes it," she wrote cruelly, clearly referencing that evening where she'd openly mocked and degraded me before our mutual friends. I practically called him tiny and inadequate, and still, he served dessert with a smile. "It's almost too easy." Her lover responded just as callously, casually dismissing any guilt she might have momentarily felt by reinforcing how inferior he considered me. "He knows he can't do better than you," read his cruel reassurance, confirming how deeply they'd both underestimated my self-worth. Reading those words ignited an emotional firestorm, a painful collision of shame, rage, and devastation I'd never imagined experiencing, not even during our worst arguments. Numbly, as if acting purely on autopilot rather than conscious thought, I returned her phone exactly to its original position, careful to avoid giving her any indication of discovery. In the painful clarity that followed, I quietly moved toward our home office, determined now to confirm exactly how extensively she deceived me beyond the intimate exchanges displayed cruelly on her phone screen. Credit card records quickly revealed countless unexplained hotel stays, romantic dinners at restaurants I'd never visited, weekend retreats disguised carefully as supposed professional conferences. All irrefutable evidence that my wife had been systematically deceiving me for months without remorse. Each line of evidence I uncovered steadily stripped away remaining doubts, painfully illuminating the scope and cruelty of her betrayal. With every new discovery, my devastation gradually solidified into steely resolve, my focus shifting slowly away from emotional anguish toward the cold practicality necessary to confront and ultimately survive this betrayal. Before the evening concluded, I quietly reached out to a trusted friend, requesting discreetly if I could temporarily stay with him, setting in motion necessary preparations for the confrontation I knew had become inevitable. The trust one once freely offered had now become permanently shattered, replaced instead by firm determination that no longer allowed room for emotional manipulation or cruel deception. Despite the heavy emotional weight pressing against my chest, I forced myself out of bed early, determined to gather every possible shred of proof needed to confront my wife decisively. I understood clearly, perhaps for the first time, that any hesitation or lack of clarity now would only grant her room to twist the narrative against me. I began systematically reviewing each of our joint financial accounts online, carefully noting down suspicious charges, unfamiliar hotel bookings, expensive restaurants, and unexplained purchases that clearly indicated a hidden affair. Each new discovery provided undeniable confirmation of my wife's double life, meticulously documented in transactions spanning over half a year, which she had hidden effortlessly beneath ordinary household expenses. Her deceit had become so ingrained and habitual that she no longer bothered to conceal payments meticulously, instead trusting completely in my blind devotion and ignorance. The credit card statements read like painful confirmations, listing romantic dinners for two at upscale establishments we'd never visited together, alongside weekend retreats billed explicitly under false pretenses as work-related conferences. After recording each suspicious entry thoroughly, I turned next to reviewing phone records available online through our shared cellular provider, another resource rich with undeniable evidence of her repeated infidelity. The logs revealed hundreds of late-night texts, intimate photos exchanged freely between my wife and her coworker, and lengthy phone calls that corresponded directly to the suspicious charges and secret meetings indicated on financial statements. Carefully, I documented dates, times, and durations, cross-referencing each entry meticulously against her previous explanations or excuses, building a timeline that demonstrated unmistakably the depth and frequency of her deceit. Each piece of information I uncovered served simultaneously as painful confirmation of betrayal and crucial ammunition necessary for the coming confrontation I knew was imminent. By mid-morning, I had assembled an overwhelming volume of evidence, saved securely on a separate, private drive, protected by a password known only to myself. Feeling confident but still wary of potential denial or manipulation, I took additional precautions, printing out physical copies of key documents, text screenshots, and hotel receipts, carefully securing them inside a folder marked innocuously as work documents. Throughout this painstakingly detailed process, I maintained complete composure outwardly, knowing instinctively that emotional detachment would become my strongest ally against the manipulations I had come to expect from my wife. Late in the afternoon, I discreetly contacted a reputable divorce attorney recommended by a close friend who had navigated similar circumstances years earlier, scheduling an immediate consultation to discuss legal protections and strategies moving forward. My attorney advised careful preparation, cautioning that accusations of infidelity or emotional abuse required meticulous documentation to avoid becoming mired in protracted disputes or retaliatory accusations during proceedings. Feeling reassured by his clear, professional guidance, I finalized arrangements, outlining carefully each step necessary to secure my financial independence and personal dignity moving forward into divorce proceedings. As evening approached, I carefully transferred half of our joint savings into a new, separate account established solely in my name, recognizing that protecting myself financially would become critical as tensions inevitably escalated. Quietly, with a focused determination that surprised even myself, I moved essential personal belongings discreetly into my friend's spare room, arranging everything meticulously to ensure a swift and seamless transition following the confrontation I intended to initiate. Throughout each step, I operated quietly, deliberately avoiding arousing suspicion or revealing intentions prematurely, fully aware that surprise would become one of my most valuable tactical advantages. By the time my wife returned home that night, smiling casually as though everything remained unchanged between us. I had completely fortified myself emotionally, financially, and legally for what lay ahead. Watching her settle carelessly onto our living room couch, mindlessly texting someone I now knew intimately through their cruel exchanges, I felt a calm, unwavering clarity replace the emotional chaos previously raging within my heart. Observing her closely, I recognized clearly now that the person I'd trusted implicitly for years had become entirely unrecognizable to me, defined solely by deceit, manipulation, and calculated emotional cruelty. In gathering undeniable proof of her betrayal, I had simultaneously gathered crucial evidence of my own strength, resolve, and willingness to protect myself from future harm. On the evening I decided to confront my wife, I deliberately prepared her favorite meal, not as a gesture of affection, but rather as a calculated attempt to disarm her emotionally. As I carefully seasoned salmon fillets, roasted vegetables, and chilled a bottle of crisp white wine, my mind rehearsed every possible outcome of the conversation ahead. I knew, based on her patterns of past manipulation, she would initially deny, then deflect, possibly becoming indignant when confronted directly with irrefutable evidence. Yet, having already resolved myself emotionally, I felt fully prepared, determined to stand firm against whatever emotional tactics she employed to maintain control or shift blame. When she arrived home, visibly surprised by the romantic ambience and the meticulously arranged dinner table, she immediately questioned the occasion, suspicion and curiosity blending subtly in her expression. With practiced calmness, I simply shrugged lightly, offering that I merely wanted to do something special, effectively masking the true intention beneath an outward facade of casual affection. She appeared momentarily reassured, accepting the wine glass I handed her with a relaxed smile, apparently dismissing any lingering suspicion in favor of comfortable complacency, exactly as I had anticipated. Together, we ate dinner in near silence, her attention frequently diverted toward her phone, messages from her lover presumably distracting her from meaningful engagement in conversation. Only after the meal concluded did I place the carefully assembled folder on the table between us, a simple, quiet gesture deliberately timed for maximum impact and clarity. Her gaze shifted immediately toward the innocuous-looking folder, eyes narrowing slightly with subtle unease, perhaps sensing intuitively the significance contained within those documents, despite having no direct knowledge yet. Choosing my words with deliberate precision, I spoke calmly, firmly informing her that we needed to discuss something extremely important, my tone clearly conveying seriousness while maintaining an emotional detachment I'd painstakingly cultivated over the previous days. Initially, she attempted deflection, sighing dramatically as she expressed exaggerated exhaustion, claiming the conversation could wait until tomorrow, a typical tactic to regain emotional control. Rejecting her attempt firmly, I opened the folder methodically, placing each printed document, screenshot, and financial record carefully before her, presenting undeniable evidence of her ongoing betrayal in stark, unmistakable clarity. Her expression rapidly cycled from shock to calculated indignation, then finally settled into open defiance, instinctively attempting to shift blame toward me by accusing me loudly of violating her privacy through accessing personal devices without explicit consent. Undeterred, I maintained composure, calmly acknowledging that, indeed, I had invaded her privacy, but emphasizing clearly that after years of emotional abuse and continuous public humiliation, I considered such actions justified. Her eyes widened incredulously at my use of the term abuse, immediately dismissing the accusation as exaggerated and absurd, attempting to trivialize my feelings further by calling me overly sensitive. Quietly, I listed the countless times she'd publicly mocked my appearance, belittled my professional accomplishments, and systematically undermined my self-confidence, confronting her explicitly with behavior she'd always disguised beneath humor or casual remarks. Instantly, her strategy shifted dramatically from indignation and denial toward contrived emotional vulnerability, tears suddenly pooling theatrically in her eyes as she pleaded desperately for forgiveness, describing her affair casually as a meaningless mistake. She claimed repeatedly that pressures at work had pushed her emotionally, insisting the entire affair constituted nothing more significant than temporary weakness, conveniently overlooking its carefully planned, prolonged nature clearly evidenced by months of documented deception. Remaining steadfast, I corrected her immediately, reminding her bluntly that 7 continuous months of calculated betrayal hardly qualified merely as brief lapses of judgment or temporary emotional weakness. At this juncture, her demeanor rapidly transitioned again from false vulnerability into bitter anger, finally revealing openly the contempt she'd previously hidden carefully behind subtle manipulation or thinly veiled cruelty. She harshly declared that my failures, emotional, financial, and physical, had directly driven her toward another man's arms, clearly justifying her betrayal, while cruelly reinforcing previous humiliations she'd inflicted publicly at our dinner party. Instead of wounding me further, her words unexpectedly granted immense relief, finally offering undeniable proof that the marriage we'd built existed purely upon illusions and emotional manipulation rather than authentic affection or mutual respect. Clearly recognizing the futility of further discussion, I calmly informed her that divorce papers had already been prepared through my attorney, firmly asserting that nothing she said now could alter my determined course forward. Her initial reaction to my firm resolve quickly transitioned into genuine panic, perhaps realizing fully for the first time that emotional manipulation had lost its effectiveness against me. As desperation broke visibly through her previously carefully controlled facade, she pleaded repeatedly, begging me loudly not to abandon the marriage, citing external perceptions and societal judgments rather than genuine affection or remorse toward me personally. With newfound clarity, I recognized immediately that her desperate pleas stemmed entirely from fear of social embarrassment rather than sincere regret for the emotional devastation she'd inflicted upon me repeatedly. Standing confidently, I gently removed her grasping hands from my arm, firmly informing her that the marriage ended entirely through her repeated cruelty and deliberate betrayals, each incident individually contributing incrementally to our eventual separation. In her shocked silence, I finally saw respect enter her gaze briefly, not affection nor regret, but merely recognition that she'd lost permanent emotional control over someone she'd relentlessly belittled and emotionally tormented. Stepping decisively toward the doorway, I paused momentarily, glancing back briefly to confirm visually the woman I'd spent years loving now appeared merely as someone driven primarily by selfishness, cruelty, and insecurity. With quiet confidence, free from anger or lingering bitterness, I offered one final honest acknowledgement, that I deserved significantly better treatment than she'd ever provided. As the door softly clicked shut behind me, her shocked disbelief echoed through our empty home, leaving behind a chapter now permanently closed in my life, freeing me finally toward authentic emotional healing and genuine self-respect. As I stepped onto the porch, suitcase firmly gripped in one hand and laptop bag securely slung over my shoulder, I felt an unexpected rush of freedom wash over me, replacing lingering emotional heaviness. Behind me, my wife's voice oscillated between desperate pleading and furious demands, echoing loudly from our living room doorway, attempting to lure me back into a dynamic she'd carefully cultivated for years. Each step forward represented a conscious decision, reaffirming my newfound commitment to reclaiming dignity, independence, and emotional stability after enduring prolonged humiliation and emotional manipulation in our marriage. Despite hearing her increasingly frantic appeals, gradually shifting from anger to desperate promises of therapy, change, and reconciliation, my determination never wavered even momentarily, resolute in its strength. My close friend patiently awaited me at the curb, seated quietly inside his car, prepared precisely according to arrangements we had carefully planned hours prior to this confrontation. Recognizing the intensity of emotions likely swirling through my mind, he tactfully avoided unnecessary commentary, simply nodding reassuringly as I climbed silently into the passenger seat beside him. Glancing briefly backward, I observed my wife standing illuminated beneath the porch light, face contorted dramatically with frustration, shock, and perhaps genuine fear at finally experiencing consequences she'd arrogantly believed herself immune from facing. A wave of complex emotions surged briefly within my chest: sadness, relief, lingering disappointment, but none powerful enough to derail the carefully considered path toward emotional recovery I'd firmly committed myself to following now. We drove silently away from a neighborhood I'd shared intimately with my wife for nearly 8 years, passing familiar houses, streets, and landmarks without speaking aloud the countless memories attached irrevocably to each location. Every turn we took gradually diminished my connection to the painful reality I'd accepted far longer than necessary, leaving behind both joyous recollections, now tarnished irreparably by deception, and painful reminders of emotional neglect repeatedly experienced. The further away our car traveled from the home I'd carefully maintained and cherished throughout our marriage, the more clearly I felt emotional burdens begin lifting steadily off my shoulders, creating space previously occupied heavily by anxiety, insecurity, and perpetual doubt instilled systematically by my wife's relentless criticism. Arriving quietly at my friend's modest but welcoming apartment offered immediate comfort, instantly contrasting starkly against the tense emotional atmosphere dominating my former household recently. Carefully placing belongings into the neatly arranged spare bedroom he'd prepared thoughtfully in advance, I momentarily paused, silently processing internally the profound shift my life had just permanently undergone within mere hours of confrontation. Though uncertainty regarding future practicalities naturally lingered beneath surface-level confidence I'd outwardly demonstrated throughout the evening, I simultaneously understood clearly this critical first step represented genuine self-empowerment previously unattainable amid continuous emotional manipulation. Instead of feeling overwhelmed or terrified by unfamiliar territory now confronting me directly, a subtle sense of quiet optimism gradually began replacing anxiety previously dominating nearly every aspect of daily existence. Throughout that initial sleepless night spent reflecting deeply upon personal revelations discovered painfully yet necessarily through recent experiences, I experienced quiet satisfaction previously unimaginable given previous emotional turmoil regularly endured privately. No longer forced into continuous self-doubt based purely upon negative evaluations consistently offered cruelly by someone supposed to cherish and emotionally support me, I felt liberated emotionally for perhaps the first genuine time since entering our ultimately toxic marriage years earlier. Realizing fully that this departure marked permanently severing ties with emotional cruelty disguised carefully beneath humor, charm, or false affection granted immense comfort, easing significantly emotional wounds previously considered permanent or irreparable. The following morning, fully committed now emotionally toward building healthier foundations based firmly upon genuine respect and authentic self-worth rather than external validation previously sought endlessly, I initiated practical steps necessary to formalize divorce arrangements swiftly and decisively. Coordinating directly with my lawyer throughout that day, I meticulously finalized essential documentation, financial arrangements, and personal decisions previously postponed indefinitely amid emotional paralysis resulting directly from continuous manipulation. Each practical detail, resolved quietly yet effectively reinforced personal strength rapidly developing internally, affirming concretely my growing emotional resilience previously obscured significantly beneath relentless emotional abuse sustained over prolonged years. As evening approached once more, quiet reflection provided additional clarity, highlighting subtle yet profound emotional shifts already occurring internally, since consciously choosing self-respect decisively over emotional manipulation previously endured consistently. Understanding intimately now precisely how drastically personal boundaries had previously eroded gradually under carefully disguised cruelty inflicted regularly by someone professing affection granted clarity previously lacking completely throughout the marriage's duration. Walking confidently away represented definitively choosing personal growth, emotional strength, and healthy self-awareness, moving forward independently toward future possibilities unrestricted emotionally by past manipulations or deceit previously tolerated silently. Ultimately, embracing fully the painful yet necessary journey toward authentic emotional freedom offered infinitely greater personal fulfillment than remaining indefinitely trapped emotionally beneath subtle, yet relentless cruelty regularly inflicted privately by someone I genuinely trusted intimately for years. Settling into my own apartment downtown became a symbol of liberation. Each piece of furniture, artwork, and personal decoration chosen solely by me, without fear of criticism or judgment. The space represented not only physical freedom, but emotional independence, unburdened by the toxic dynamics I'd experienced throughout our marriage. Reconnecting with old friends who had quietly stepped back due to my wife's subtle yet controlling influence further restored a sense of belonging and authenticity I hadn't felt in years. These friendships provided vital emotional support during my early stages of recovery, helping me recognize and appreciate my true worth. Alongside these changes, I actively pursued therapy, openly addressing emotional wounds left by years of subtle manipulation. Guided by my therapist, I began understanding how my self-esteem had been systematically eroded, identifying clearly the unhealthy patterns I'd accepted as normal within our relationship. This newfound clarity gave me tools to prevent repeating similar dynamics in the future, empowering me to maintain stronger emotional boundaries moving forward. Professionally, without my wife's persistent criticism undermining my confidence, I rediscovered ambition and productivity I'd previously suppressed. Taking on projects that once intimidated me, I soon achieved tangible success, including a promotion that validated my abilities independently of external approval. Each professional milestone I reached further solidified my internal confidence, proving conclusively that my worth was no longer tied to anyone else's perception or validation. Eventually, months after our separation, I met someone new, a woman whose kindness, sincerity, and genuine respect contrasted sharply with my previous experiences. Our connection was easy and comfortable, free from judgment or unrealistic expectations, slowly restoring my faith in genuine emotional intimacy. Gradually, our interactions deepened naturally into meaningful companionship, further reinforcing my belief in a future based on mutual trust and emotional honesty rather than manipulation. Through each deliberate step toward independence, professionally, emotionally, and personally, I steadily reclaimed my sense of self-worth, building a new life founded firmly upon respect, trust, and genuine fulfillment. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you like the story, please give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Your support helps the algorithm show my content more often. If you are new to the channel, do not forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps me keep making more stories for you.